When we look at utility theory, this is a discussion about the background to the theory of demand. We saw in our earlier discussions that the demand curve is downward sloping. In other words, when the price goes down, the quantity goes up. And we also looked at the fact that demand requires both the willingness and ability. So with the utility theory, we're trying to also relook into the concept of the downward sloping demand curve and see it from another perspective. Now, what is utility? People, we believe, buy goods and services because they get some benefit or satisfaction. Now, this benefit or satisfaction in economics is called utility. In other words, it's the satisfaction gained from the consumption of goods and services. When we look at utility, we make two kinds of distinction. One is total utility and another one is marginal utility. Total utility is simply what we call sometimes the total satisfaction that we get from any good or service. In other words, it is the total amount of satisfaction from a given amount of good. While marginal utility is simply the extra utility that we get from a consumption of a particular unit. So for example, I love to drink a lot of tea, and let's say I drink 6 cups of tea in a day. Now, in reality, we cannot measure utility for any good or service, because if you ask me how much satisfaction do I get from, let's say, 6 cups of tea, I may not have any answer, because I don't know how much satisfaction I get. I do know I get satisfaction from tea, and I know that I may get it more than I get it from, let's say, coffee, but I can't tell you exactly how much will I get from a particular cup of tea or particular day's consumption of tea. But for our analysis, let's assume that we can measure utility, and let's say we measure it in some imaginary units called utils or units of utility. So my satisfaction from the 0 cup will be, of course, 0, because when I don't consume a good, I don't get any satisfaction. And the margin is the extra, and because nothing extra is consumed or received in terms of utility, my margin is also 0. When it comes to the first cup of tea, let's assume that the satisfaction that I get from my very first cup of tea is very high. Let's say I get 10 units of extra utility. Now this would mean my extra utility is 10, my total will also become 10. But then comes the second cup. Let's say second cup gives me a satisfaction of something like 8. That would mean my total will now be 18. So if somebody asks me, what is the total satisfaction that you get from, let's say, 2 cups of tea, I'll say 18 units of utility. Similarly, I can make this table, and let's say the third cup gives me, for example, 6. That will make my total to become 24 for the third cup, while the fourth cup gives me 4. That will make my total to become 28 for the fourth cup. And then for the fifth month, for example, I get only 3, which makes it 31. And for the last cup, for example, I get nothing, no satisfaction, so my total remains 31. So as you can see from this, that we are looking at the marginal utility to be the extra satisfaction that we get from consuming one extra unit, but also as you consume more and more of this good, or consume more and more of the tea, my total is going up. Now there are some things that I would like to talk about. Why did I not get any satisfaction for the, let's say, the 6th cup? And the logic could be, like I've already had 5 cups and I don't want the 6th cup, but if I have it, it's not really giving me any benefit. If it was something for free, I would be okay to consume it because the price is 0 for me, for example, then I'm willing to basically be okay with having no benefit. Normally, if something is not giving you any benefit, you should stop consuming it. So the 6th cup, I may stop because my utility from the 6th cup is, for example, 0. One more thing to notice is that as quantity goes up, the TU or total utility is rising, but it's rising not at the same rate. The first cup gave me the maximum possible satisfaction of 10, but the second cup is not giving me the same amount of satisfaction. In fact, the sort of satisfaction goes down with each subsequent cup of tea. So in other words, as quantity goes up, TU rises, but MU, marginal utility, goes down. And the reason why marginal utility falls is because something what we call is the law of diminishing marginal utility, which simply states that as a person increases consumption of a product, there is a decline in the marginal utility that is derived from the consumption of each additional unit. And one may agree with this because as we consume more and more of a good, the total satisfaction may still go up, but the marginal satisfaction or utility may fall. Like, for example, the first slice of pizza will give you the maximum possible satisfaction, then the second one, and then the third one will be lower than the second one, and so on. And this law or principle, we believe, does hold true for many goods. Now, there are some goods out there which may not have the same principle. Now, for example, if you're a stamp collector or if you are a car collector, then the first car will give you satisfaction, but the second one will give you more satisfaction, and the third one will also have a higher satisfaction than the second, and so on. So one may argue this, that most goods may follow this principle of law of diminishing marginal utility, but not all goods have the principle. However, for our discussion for this chapter, we'll assume that we have what we call the law of diminishing marginal utility, which simply means as the quantity of a good goes up, the total utility rises slowly because the marginal utility, which is the extra satisfaction, actually falls. We can use this knowledge of total and marginal utility and draw their curves. Now, when you look at total utility curve, the x-axis for us will be the quantity, while the y-axis will be total utility or TU. On the other hand, when we draw our MU curve, the x-axis will be quantity and the y-axis will be MU. As you can see that as you consume more and more units, TU goes up or rises, but it rises at a slower rate. Now, why does that happen? We said this because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, which also implies that my MU or marginal utility falls as the quantity of a good rises. We can notice some important points from these graphs and also comment on them. First thing first, that MU slopes downward due to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Second, as you can see, TU is starting from origin, which means zero consumption have zero utility. The third important thing we can say is that MU is simply the rate at which TU is changing. In other words, if I find out the slope of TU, the slope or gradient of TU will be change in Y or change in X, which in this case will be change in TU over change in Q, and that simply means my marginal utility is the extra satisfaction that I get from one additional unit, which means TU or MU is simply change in TU over change in Q, or in other words, it's the slope or the rate at which TU is changing. So to sum up our discussion, what we learned today is that whenever we consume a good or service, we will get satisfaction, and this satisfaction is called utility. In utility, we look at two concepts, our total utility and marginal utility. Total utility is the total satisfaction that we get from consumption of a particular quantity of a good in a particular time period. Let's say 6 cups of tea in a day. Marginal utility, on the other hand, is the extra satisfaction that we get from consuming one extra unit. In other words, marginal utility is the rate at which TU is changing. What we also learned in this discussion is that as the quantity of a good we consume rises, our TU, total utility, rises, but slowly. The reason why the total utility rises at slower rate is primarily because the marginal utility is declining. And we said that this happens because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, which simply states that as a person increases consumption of a good, there is a decline in the MU or marginal utility or extra satisfaction derived from consumption of each additional unit. In other words, the second unit will give you lower satisfaction than the first one, the third unit will give you lower satisfaction than the second one, and so on. We also talked about this principle does hold true for many goods, but there might be some goods out there in the world which does not have the law of diminishing marginal utility working for them. Nonetheless, for our concept, we will use the law of diminishing marginal utility to hold true. Now, in the next video, we'll use this knowledge of MU and TU to derive an individual's demand curve.